Chapter 1.8, Focal Point and Emphasis. So focal point is a specific place where an artist is trying to draw your attention, right? And so when you think about focal point, think about visually emphasis, right? Visual emphasis, where visually an artist is taking you. Whereas in emphasis, it's the principle of which an artist draws attention to a particular content. And then subordination, we'll talk about that as well, is the complete opposite. So we'll look at some examples of this. But emphasis and focal point do usually accentuate the concepts, the themes, and the ideas that the artist is trying to express. So with focal point, and this is one of the ones that you'll probably use a lot, is trying to find a focal point and see if there's one. But usually it's used to give a specific emphasis to an important, either a symbol, an event, or a feature in the work. So usually they'll place it in the area where they want you to look at, where you want your eye to go to. So in a lot of these paintings, like our eye normally goes to a certain place, and you really don't ever think about why it goes there. It just kind of lands there. So in a lot of these, it's really the artist doing it, like giving you these visual clues to lead you to the focal point. In Judith Decapitating Holofernes by Artemisia Jelensky, we see where she uses directional lines to draw the viewer to the point where she wants you to see. So if you look at the legs, the arms, they're all leading to this one spot. This is a great example of how directional lines create the focal point, right? So here we see where all the blood is, and this is the point, the focal point where the artist wants you to look. So these contrast of values, the directional lines, they really fix and stare your pointer too, because if you think about the value, right, the contrast between this dark area and then this lighter area, definitely it draws your eye towards this. It brings you to that focal point. In The Bride's Toilet by Amrita Shergill, you see where the artist does the same use of contrast. There's kind of darker outside, and then the main focal point is the lighter girl here in the center. This is Milton Glaser. So in this piece right here was a poster commissioned by the World Health Organization. And so it was a worldwide effort to stop AIDS. And so you see like the heart, and then right in the center, you see this image like of a skull, maybe death, right? And so that was the idea of creating that focal. So in this worldwide effort to prevent AIDS and transmission, they actually created this piece to make you look at that bright blue skull against that red heart for this really dramatic effect. So with emphasis, we talked about the idea of that it has more about the context, right? And so it's going to be broader. So the entire work, or a broad area within the work, multiple areas or specific points can be emphasized, not just specifically one visual point. Broad emphasis is where you have multiple elements within a work, but no one element dominates. So for example, right here, we see this image here. There's not one point here that dominates this area. The whole thing is kind of the same. So in this composition, it doesn't have a specific, like, one visual focal point. So this would be an example of emphasis, broad emphasis. This is another example of emphasis. And so if you think about the idea of why an artist would use a focal point and then emphasis, right? In a focal point, like in that AIDS poster, it was drawing you directly to that skull because it's trying to communicate that idea, right? And so in this piece right here, the idea that emphasis is used, right? It really draws into the context. So this is a piece called Jacob Lawrence. John Brown remains a full winter in Canada, drilling Negroes from his coming raids on Harper's Ferry, number 17. So if you think about the idea of this artist giving homage to Civil War era abolitionist John Brown, you're going to say, okay, well then why didn't he draw you directly to John Brown? But if you think about the message that John Brown was putting out there, is that each figure attracts your attention. And so that idea that no one stands alone. So everyone in here is worthy of your attention. So the composition is balanced with separate areas and emphasis, and it implies this idea of equality among men. And so that's why that would be important. Why, when we're looking at these analyses, we're looking for that kind of, why did they use this and what did it create? So with subordination is the total opposite of emphasis and focal point. In subordination, what the artist is doing is drawing the viewer's attention away from a particular part of the composition. This is subordination. And so if you think about that idea, why would an artist want to make you look away from something, right? It's deliberate, but it's also trying to kind of reduce the impact of certain details. So if the artist is telling you a story, right, and it's important, but it's not that important, right? Because the final message that he's giving you is very different. So, for example, in Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, some of you are familiar with the story, but basically what Icarus, the story behind Icarus is that his father and Icarus are imprisoned, and so the father builds these wings, and he uses wax to make these wings. Puts them on Icarus, and he tells him, don't fly too close to the sun because they'll melt and you'll fall to your death. And so the first thing that Icarus does is flies up to the sun, the wings melt, and he falls to his death, right? But the artist this is the title of the piece, but the artist is saying, okay, I'm going to tell you the story, but there is a moral behind this story. And that's what he's trying to portray in this piece, right? So Icarus is the subordination in this piece. If you look at the piece in a whole, you see like a farmer plowing, and you'll see the trees, the mountains, maybe a ship, the water, another ship. And then you're like, well, where's Icarus? And if you look closer, you'll see Icarus here plunging to his death. But he's not our focal point. This is not where he wants us to look, right? And so if we understand focal point, he leads us to this man right here. And so this is our focal point. So the story of the Fall of Icarus has a moral story behind it, right? And so for him here, it was the idea of that life continues, right? So even as a man dies, we continue. So he continues plowing. So even after a man goes down, there's still life to live on. That's the message. And that's why an artist would use subordination. So focal point and emphasis in action. Let's talk about how an artist uses it. We can identify it. And so now we need to know how it was created. And this is part of your analysis when you do your museum project, and also when you do like analysis in class. So an artist will use direction, they'll use contrast, and then they'll also use placement to create these two different things. So just kind of keep that in mind, that how did the elements, how are they organized, how the elements organized in the work to draw our attention to these specific areas, to emphasis and focal point. So with contrast, we're looking for the effects of contrast by positioning elements that are very different and next to one another. So remember when we talked about the idea of contrast in earlier lectures, where if we have two different elements together next to each other, they're going to create contrast. We talked about the idea of like geometric shapes and organic shapes next to each other create contrast. Colors can also create contrast, black and white. Line can create, right? So if we have regular lines and irregular lines, they create contrast. So by using two different elements together, they'll create contrast. So in this piece right here, the artist creates contrast again with those lights here in the center and then the darks in the outside, right? So this is an example of an artist creating a focal point with contrast, right? You've got the darks and you've got the lights. With line, also an artist can create a focal point or emphasis with line. And so in this piece right here, when we look at line and we look at these lines, it's definitely going to draw our attention and take us to this bottom part right here. So they're almost like directional lines as well. So if you look at the diagram here, right, this kind of cross in this, the water, it's all leading us to the bottom. And this is our focal point. So the artist is creating a focal point using directional line. And this is what you would use in your analysis. Placement is another way that an artist can create the focal point. And so if you think about where an artist places something, could be considered a focal point. With focal points, you could have several focal points. It's not always just one specific, right? So also kind of keep that in mind. So for this piece right here, Riverside Bamboo Market, you see where the artwork has three separate focal points. It's got the moon, the bridge, and the figure in the boat. And so because of these kind of varying distances between these three shapes, it creates rhythm as well, right? So it's like creates even a more interesting. So you have the moon, the bridge, and then the man in the boat. Those are three different points. So placement, where did he put it, right? Sometimes you'll see where an artist will put, like, for example, let's say that this boat was really large and it's up in the front, right? Our eye automatically goes to that. It's considered placement and creating focal point. So how did the artist create focal point in this piece? By creating these three different points and varying the distance between it to create this these three different focal points. Placement, using placement.